Moreover, in keeping with the promise of being a Bill Young Republican, Congressman Jolly has scheduled a Veterans Intake Day for his staff to personally meet with local veterans to gauge the quality of their medical care firsthand. As a veteran myself, it is with great pleasure that I ask the Suncoast Tiger Bay Club to join me in welcoming Congressman David Jolly.
Todd, thank you. I want to thank Todd. That was a very well-informed introduction. The problem is that's everything I was just about to say. So, Art said if I speak a long time, we get fewer questions. Now I'm really hitting the bankruptcy of what to talk about. Listen, thank you for letting me be here. I am a former member of the board of directors of Tiger Bay, and I will tell you this, and many elected officials here today have been through this process. For as much as sometimes people might feel uncomfortable with it, I think Tiger Bay is probably the greatest civic organization we have locally. Because it holds... And listen, that's coming from somebody who really doesn't want to be right here, right now. But it holds people accountable, and it allows for a discourse that I think is appropriate. Very few organizations actually give an award for the person who asked the hardest question, but I think that's a good thing. You know, in preparing for today, to the extent that I prepared for it, I'll tell you, we also scheduled Taping Political Connections an hour ago, because I figured it's the same set of questions coming. We might as well get them both done in the same morning. Other thing I want to tell you about Todd, I have this little trick I've developed, because I find myself in a lot of situations where I want to make sure that I stay on point. I don't really write speeches. What I do is I get a business card and I put comments on the back of it. So today the comments are a gift of Todd Jennings on his business card. If you don't like him, he's responsible for it. If you do, Todd, I appreciate the business card. Let me share with you just a little bit. Look, this entire community went through a race that I think none of us ever want to go through again. I recognize that. So let me just share with you a little bit of our first 2 or 3 months in office that at times seems like 10 or 20 years already. Let me give you a little bit of background on that, and then again, keeping with the notion that I really think there's great value in Tiger Bay, let's do as many Q&As as we can get through today. I ran on the notion, you know, one of the things I tried to convince people is that we were replacing somebody with 43 years of experience with the most junior member of Congress, number 435 out of number 435. And the ability to be effective, at least the case I tried to make, would be enhanced by the fact that I had about 20 years working with my predecessor, and in one capacity or another working with the United States Congress. And so as soon as we got elected, we went to work right away. And Todd mentioned some of the things. The first thing we did is we opened not just a local office in Seminole, which Mr. Young had, but for those of you in St. Petersburg, I honored a request of Rick Baker and others, and we opened a St. Petersburg office within the first couple of weeks, and we've got that right up here on 4th Street. And then we went to Washington and we set out to staff up the office. Now, I will also tell you this on staff. I kind of turned the model upside down a little bit. We put about 11 or 12 staff members here in our local offices. And in terms of professional staff in D.C., I believe we really only have 4 full-time staff members. Our chief of staff is here locally, J.D. White over here in the corner, along with Preston Rudy, our communications director, who's here locally as well. They travel to D.C. as needed. We have caseworkers in the office as well as some of the younger policy folks. And then in D.C. we put a legislative staff. We kept our scheduler down here in the district as well. I've tried to turn the model upside down a little bit and listen, hold myself accountable. I made the case that I could get up there and do the job, and you had to do the job. And so because of that, we don't need a large staff in D.C. I'd rather have a staff here locally. I have tried to serve the entire community as quickly as I could. So we moved on flood insurance. I don't think the recent relief was enough. First of all, I think it should extend to commercial properties and owner-occupied second homes. I'd love to see it extend to investment properties as well. I think we have to get there. That's a much harder political sell. We have difficulty right now moving on commercial and second homes, I'll tell you, and maybe we'll handle it in a Q&A, but that will be a challenge. We moved pretty quickly on a beach re-nourishment issue in Treasure Island. For very technical reasons, The beach renourishment authorization in Treasure Island would have likely expired had we not been able to secure a provision really in the first 6 weeks. And we did that on a technical level by working with professional staff and by me asking our leadership for their assistance in getting it done, and we were able to get that done. City of Clearwater had a HUD issue, so George Credicus came up and we did something a little different. Instead of asking HUD to come to us, George and I got in the car and we went down to HUD. And I can tell you the moment we arrived, they already had it solved, because they appreciated the fact that the mayor and the congressman would come to them. And so they filled up the room with people telling us how they had it solved. We moved quickly with Mayor Kreisman and others to try to secure additional research funding for Bayboro to address many things, from oil spill studies to invasive species studies when it comes to fisheries, to water quality, whatever it might be. The fact is we have an incredible asset in marine sciences down here at Bayboro, and I pledged to Mayor Kreisman I'm going to fight to enhance the research activities there. And then also on VA, and maybe I'll save VA for the end so we can talk about it, but I will also talk about, very briefly, being the youngest member and sometimes what it takes to walk into a body of 435 members as the newest kid. Some of you may have seen my vote on the Ryan budget. And I will tell you, there's nothing different about my vote on the Ryan budget than there is about every other one of my votes. I think about absolutely every single vote, and I think about what it means for this district. I think about what it means for this community. When I pledged to run, I said I'm not interested in representing just Republicans in Pinellas County. I'm interested in representing all of Pinellas County. Now understand that's difficult. Anybody who's had an elected office, you understand you have certain convictions. All of us here in the room today do. I certainly do. And so I try to blend those convictions and work with those convictions as they're reflected in the community of Pinellas County. And at the end of the day, I know I can stand by my decision on each vote. Even if we disagree on certain votes, I know I can stand by my decision and how I arrived at that vote. Now I will tell you, sometimes that means going up against your own party. And the Ryan budget probably was the one that made the most news about me going up against my own party. And I don't do that lightly. I certainly didn't do it to further my political career within my own party, because there's not that reward at the end of the tunnel when you vote no on the Ryan budget. But I did so based on conviction. I said during the race that while I believe long-term debt is the greatest threat to the United States, and I do, that at the end of the day we needed to embrace long-term reforms over a longer cost curve than what was in the Ryan budget. Be less disruptive to the economy, but also address the need, the fact that promises have been made to each and every one of us in this room, and we have to honor that as we begin to address any reform. Now, conviction's a funny thing, because there comes the moment where you actually have to honor that conviction. And I will tell you that very morning, knowing I was going to vote no, but having thought for 4 days about voting no, I understood the significance of what I was about to do. It is a very lonely place to be one of 12 members of your own caucus to vote against your party's budget. Very quiet place on the House floor. There's not it's like a pitcher pitching a perfect game, and in the 9th inning there's nobody sitting by him. That's kind of what it feels like down there. But I'll tell you that the conviction behind it reminded me of the story of the Navy captain who was commanding a cruiser off the west coast of Florida, and he had a young sailor on the ship. And that young sailor's father was a 3-star admiral. So the 3-star admiral had come out to the deck to spend an overnight on the ship. So the captain of the ship wanted to make sure everything went just perfectly. He didn't sleep that night. So in the middle of the night, he sees something off in the distance, and he realizes he's going to take command right away. And so he gets on the radio and he says, "Sir, this is Commander Johnson, and I am requesting you immediately turn 20 degrees to the right." The voice comes back over and says, "Negative, Commander Johnson. You turn 20 degrees to the right." Well, the commander thinks, that's not happening. This is my night, the admiral's on board. So he says, "I'm going to repeat, sir, this is Commander Johnson, captain of this ship, and I'm demanding that you turn 20 degrees to the right." The voice came back and said, "Negative. You turn 20 degrees to the right." So the captain thinks, all right, I know what to do. He runs down, he wakes up the 3-star admiral, he says, "Come here, I need your help with something." Tells him what happens. The 3-star admiral gets on the radio. Says, "Sir, this is Admiral Smith. I am demanding immediately you turn 20 degrees to the right." The voice comes back on and says, "Admiral, this is Seaman First Class Smith, and I work the overnight shift at the lighthouse, and I'm requesting that you turn 20 degrees to the right." My point being in the UK, being a young kid sometimes, requires honoring the conviction because you believe it's right for the course that we're on. And so that was simply what was reflected in my Ryan budget vote, but I will tell you, more important is every other vote that occurs every other day from here on, and honoring that same conviction, whether it's newsworthy or not. Let me talk very briefly about the VA, and then we'll go to Q&A. I do serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and it's a very special place right now. And I want to say two things before any comments about the VA that absolutely should be on the record every step of the way. This is not political, and it shouldn't be political. And nobody should make it political. Nobody on either side of the aisle should fundraise off of it. Nobody should scream at each other about this being a political issue. It's absolutely not. This is an issue we have to get right, and there's nothing political about demanding accountability. There's nothing political about suggesting reforms that are appropriate, and there's nothing political about arguing about those, as long as we keep it in a constructive spirit. We have two issues that we have to address within the VA right now, and the first one is the one of urgency. The first one is clearing the wait list. We have to clear the wait list now. That's different than reforms. The numbers change every day. Is it 57,000 people on the waiting list, or is it 90,000? The fact is, it's one too many. We have to clear the wait list now. The administration, the VA secretary, currently has the statutory authority to send people out to private sector care. We are trying to loosen that within the Congress. Hopefully the administration will agree and make it even more flexible. But the idea is give the veteran a choice. Give the veteran a choice. If they want to go outside the system, let them go outside the system immediately. And here's why. Veterans have died. We get caught in the 24-hour news cycle, he said, she said, who's right, who's wrong. But every time you think of the VA story, and every time you hear something, remember, veterans have died as a result of this. The FBI has initiated criminal investigation into negligence that led to the death of veterans. That's not just unacceptable for the United States Congress, it's unacceptable for every United States citizen. And it's unacceptable to the President of the United States. And I want to compliment the acting Secretary of the VA right now. I believe he has finally realized the urgency. I believe the administration has realized the urgency. They are in the process of contacting 90,000 people and identifying ways to get them outside of the system. Now I, as a member of the committee, but I think everybody else should as well, am watching very closely to see how successful that is. Because as the acting Secretary has said, his words, there's a compromise of integrity in the VA leadership right now at the regional level. And so we do have to provide oversight. We do have to watch that. Second thing that I always want to say as well when we talk about it is the care that is received at the VA hospital gets remarkable commendations from those who are at the hospital. And it reflects the staff and the doctors and the people there at Bay Pines and Haley and elsewhere. We have good people working at the hospital. It's a failure of leadership somewhere in the system, and that's what has to be addressed. We need to clear the wait list immediately. Without hesitation, clear the wait list, absolutely whatever it takes. That's what we do today. Secondly, though, we need long-term reforms. This is a historic crisis. As I mentioned, people have died. It's a historic crisis, and it demands historic reforms. Now, those historic reforms, I would rather see them done right than done quickly. So as much as we're making demands, and we have this urgency, that's about clearing the wait list. When it comes to the future of the VA healthcare system, it's about getting it right. And that requires a conversation with veteran service organizations, with a budget team, and with the VA itself to determine what does the future look like. Some have talked about feeing everything out, turning it into vouchers. I don't think the veterans organizations would want that, to be honest. I think they really appreciate the care they get at the VA hospital. So let's talk about other solutions, choice being one of them. If you're a veteran and you would prefer to go outside the system, is there a way to ensure that you can go either or, either inside or outside? But secondly, the idea I would like to see us explore more is if the issue is a failure of integrity among the leadership within the healthcare system, then why don't we address management? Why don't we look at whether or not we should competitively award management contracts for VA hospital systems and award them to private sector hospital healthcare providers that run regional systems every day and have very different results than a system that's resulted in the death of its own patients. I don't know where that answer is, and I'm not telling you today that that's the exact answer. But those are the type of reforms we need to consider because the veterans deserve it. My concern with the current VA crisis, I said this at the beginning, I believe the political establishment is always too late to identify a crisis. But I think the political establishment is also too quick to to declare a crisis resolved. And I will tell you, in the next week or two, my fear is we will begin to see reports that the wait list is coming down, and then we will move on to other issues, be it Iraq or foreign policy or whatever it might be. And we'll be here next year seeing no substantive change in the VA other than providing flexibility to see outside providers. I think we have to stay on top of this every step of the way. That is my initial report from Washington, and Art, with that, I will gladly take as many questions as we can work.
Great.
That's fine.
Right here.
Please,
Wait,
here.
hold on, microphone. State your name.
Rebecca Falkenberry. I'm pleased to hear you voted against the extreme Ryan budget. I'd like to know if you see any other votes coming down the road that you might differ with the Republican Party on, such as gun control, voting rights, or global climate change.
Sure. 2 minutes to respond. The first question is, what legislation comes to the floor? And I'll tell you, that's one of my greatest concerns. I believe the House should work. I believe the House should govern. I believe we should put legislation on the floor and let the House work its will. We don't see that, frankly, in either body right now. That's not a Republican or Democratic issue. It's the same policies in each, and I will say I think the House does a little bit better in bringing legislation to the floor. But that's the first question. The issues you mentioned, and I'll try to touch on them very quickly. First, let's recognize that each one of those issues are difficult issues. And I think you should throw in there immigration. If we're taking on gun control and climate change, let's put immigration in there as well. These are difficult issues that we have to get right. And this goes to the spirit of getting the Congress to work and to work together. Most of what I'll tell you, and I'll try to make it quickly because most of it's on the record from the campaign. Look, I'm a Republican who believes that the climate is changing and man has had an impact. Okay? Absolutely. Let's not lose sight of it. But I'm also a conservative who believes whatever reforms we put into place have to recognize that jobs in the economy are created by the private sector and can be destroyed by the government. And so, and I shared this with you earlier, my concern on an issue like climate change is this. If you look at the blended fuel standards that they put out several years ago, they set a benchmark for industry that could not be met. And they put all this added expense on industry, and at the end of the day, they delayed the rule. I think the incentives of the American people, of industry, and those who believe in protecting the environment, which I'm one of them, we can get them all to align if we can get everybody at the table to recognize, yes, we need to get there. Yes, we need to protect the environment. Yes, we need to improve fuel standards and everything else that addresses climate change. But let's do so in a way that does not completely disrupt the private sector economy that actually creates jobs. The other issues, we ran out of time, but maybe we'll get to it here shortly. I'll try to get back to it.
Bob Supranski, my question, Congressman, is when are we going to get an oil line built from Canada down here so we can get fuel oil and that we don't support all these trains that I think there's someone who's a very large provider to our president financially who benefits from oil trains coming down from Canada and other places. So when are we going to get that oil line down, and when is he going to use his thing and sign the let it come?
So, and this is a great follow-on to this, because this is a perfect example of where I think Washington, even when it succeeds in working out a compromise, and everybody's afraid to embrace that compromise. You can look at it in Rubio's immigration bill, right? He takes creative, he puts his political capital on the line, and yet then everybody has to step away from it. On Keystone, it's time that Keystone happens right now. And here's why. We need to get to energy independence. When it was first introduced, there were significant environmental concerns, and they were addressed. The path through Nebraska, I believe, was rerouted. All of the environmental concerns that could be addressed were addressed. So let's recognize that. Personally, politically, I think the president should enact it right away and get it off the table going into 2016 for the sake of his own party. because this issue's not going to go away. And what we're seeing in Iraq right now, look, a month from now, the storyline is going to be increased gas prices. No question. No question whatsoever. We're going to see increased gas prices as a result of instability in the Middle East. People are going to begin to talk now about Keystone and other things. I think it needs to happen, personally.
Jim Jackson, welcome, Congressman. Second time here. A better time this time. Educator of 40 years, but also have a granddaughter in middle school in Miami. I'm almost becoming numb, but I'm not, to the gun violence we see on school campuses. Congress has been, well, they haven't done anything, frankly. What do you suggest in terms of closing the loopholes with those people that really have mental disorders and should never be able to get it done?
I agree with you, and we need to get it done, and let me tell you what I just did. That resulted in criticism from a lot of people. I voted for an amendment that would increase funding for background checks. Because we have a system right now where we can identify people who shouldn't have a gun. Does it need to be improved? Yes, it needs to be dramatically improved. The issue when it comes to mental health is this, and I've sat with the sheriff and others, and this is one, please understand, I'm not going to come out with a yes or no 30 seconds from now, but I want to walk you through what I struggle with so you understand the way we approach this. There are HIPAA issues involved in whether or not a background check includes mental health issues. And then there's also the moral hazard of if mental health issues are going to be a part of a background check, and if HIPAA rules are going to be changed, then if you're somebody who suffers from a mental illness, are you really going to self-report and you're really going to seek that type of care if you know it's going to have the long-term effect? I don't know where the answer is, but we need to do better and we need to fix it. And I will say, look, we've only had a couple votes when it comes to issues like this. I stand by my vote to increase funding for background checks. I have concerns, of course, I think a lot of people do, with how those records are kept, the ultimate disposition of those records, what that means for personal liberties. I do believe that the Second Amendment is a fundamental right, but I don't believe it's beyond the reach of regulation. And I believe it's appropriate to look at regulations that ultimately keep the guns out of the hands of criminals. This is one that's an exceedingly hard issue, and I'm waiting for the day that we can figure out exactly how to do it in a way that honors the Constitution, but also is very effective.
I'm Gregory Wilson, and I too welcome you. It happened on his watch, but he wasn't just any bureaucrat. I was wondering if you called for or supported the call for the resignation of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Shinseki. This calling for the heads of people when faults are found, just how constructive do you think that is?
Sure, that's a great question. So I ultimately did not call for his resignation. You know, that I said towards the end his clearest days were numbered just because politically he had lost so much support. I agree with the spirit with which you asked that question. The reason I did not quickly call for Shinseki's resignation, and understand for those of you who don't know his background, General Shinseki is a war hero and a great American who was asked to task heading the VA. And I will tell you, I was in the room when he had been nominated by President Obama. I was with Mr. Young when Mr. Young said to the General, "Eric, you don't want to take this job." He said, Mr. Young said, "I have been through so many VA secretaries, and you don't want to take this job. This is probably the hardest job you'll ever take on." Here's why I didn't call for his resignation right away, but I'll tell you, I was about a week from doing so had we not seen changes. The Undersecretary at the time, Deputy Secretary Sloan Gibson, had just come in March. In fact, there's a funny story. I got called to hurry up and get down to my very first VA hearing because they said, "The new guy's going to be here. You got to get here." And I said, "Well, I am the new guy." but they were talking about Sloan Gibson. So understand the Deputy Secretary took office about the same time I did, a little bit earlier. The Undersecretary for Health resigned in the wake of this. So if Shinseki had gone too early, then where is the leadership that understood how we got here and how to solve it? Now that being said, I was a critic of the administration and of Shinseki because I did not see the urgency early on that I expected we would see. And that goes to clearing the wait list now. right? And it's not political. But I would say clear the wait list now. I wrote a letter to the president. It was a Thursday or Friday shortly after this happened. We talked to the general counsel's office and asked, does the VA need any additional statutory authority to send people out to the private sector? General counsel said no. So I wrote a letter saying, clear the wait list now using the private sector. He had resigned by the time we got any response. My concern was the lack of urgency. Had he shown that in the next week, I would have been happy to work with him. Sloan Gibson is showing that urgency.
Welcome, Congressman.
Thank you.
I'm Councilman Newton, City of St. Pete. I know how it is to be on the lone vote with your colleagues. I was the only no vote on the pier in the lane, so I know how that goes. But in the spirit of the veterans and what's happening with the VA, and the spirit of leaving no man behind, do you think the president was wrong to bring that prisoner of war home from Afghanistan by any means necessary?
So, very plainly, no, he was not wrong to bring him home. I have significant reservations and frankly disagree with how he did it. We should welcome Bo Bergdahl home, but I have grave concerns about what happened. And I will share with you, I take my job very seriously. When Congress passes an intelligence budget, it's classified. And there are only 40 to 60 members of Congress that take the time to go down and read the bill because it can't be debated on the floor. I was one of them because I take it very seriously. When the White House provided a classified brief on the operations to recover Bo Bergdahl, I went to that brief because I take it very seriously. Here's my concern with what the president did. And you can nuance it all you want. This is my opinion. Number one, he did in fact negotiate with terrorists, and I believe that that has put American lives in greater danger. Second, in doing so, he released 5 Al-Qaeda operatives who have already said they're going to again wage war against the United States. Third, he broke the law by ignoring a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act by not notifying anybody in Congress. He doesn't have to notify the entire Congress. Notify the Speaker and the Majority Leader. That's notification. That's fine. And fourth, he put our special operators in direct hand-to-hand contact with the Taliban, sitting in a bowl that was surrounded by additional Taliban operatives. I don't think it was the right way to do it. I think if we had the intelligence on where he was, we keep working that intelligence and we go get him. We have the greatest military on the face of the earth. Many of the guys over at SOCOM are personal friends of mine, and the concerns from many in the special operations community, I believe, would reflect what I just indicated, that there were other ways to get him. At the end of the day, Bo's home, and we should welcome him home. Excuse me, we should welcome him home. I will also say this: nobody in the Congress of the United States should judge how he fell into the hands of the prisoners. The Army will work that out itself. That's not a political issue and not one that's appropriate for Congress to talk about.
Thank you. Congressman Neil McMullen, with many efforts made and not made, many mistakes not made and made, many plans laid and come awry, bring us to the point that evidently we've underestimated the strength and power of the radical Sunni faction in the Near East. What is your thinking, what is Congress's thinking about where we stand at this point in Iraq?
I would say universally, obviously not being able to speak for everybody, but the general tenor is there's no appetite for boots on the ground from either side of the party right now, other than perhaps every individual can have their own thoughts. I do think, though, that the option of intervention in some way should be on the table for the specific purpose of protecting American lives. And there's no comma in that sentence. Mitch, I want to make sure you get this. Mitch Perry with Creative Loafing. Intervention, whether airstrikes or not, should be a consideration on the table for the purpose of protecting American lives. We have thousands of Americans at the Baghdad embassy right now in Iraq that is being marched on, and the president should recognize the danger and threat that is posed to them and should afford enough intervention to protect their lives, just as he did Bo Bergdahl, and frankly, in my opinion, respond more quickly than they responded in Libya to prevent another Libya from happening again. I am not somebody who is looking for intervention whatsoever. I wish we lived in a world where we didn't have to. The fact is, we live in a world with an incredible asymmetric threat against our national security interests. We live in a world where 5 people can cause significant harm to the United States and the interests of the United States. We live in a world where 5 people could probably take the lives of every person that's in the embassy right now in Iraq. We owe them the same loyalty and the same protection and the same consideration of exercising our own strength that the President showed in Bo Bergdahl. And we don't need to release 5 members of the Taliban just to get our people out of the embassy. We can do that much sooner.
I'm Yopi Helson. I want to ask a Republican question, I guess. For 4 years, the Republicans knew that Obama was going to run for re-election, and they bashed each other as candidates until they reluctantly backed Romney. Will in the next few years, or actually 2060 is coming up, will they actually be able to back a candidate that's going to go up against Hillary Clinton effectively?
So, that's a good question. I will also tell you this, going back to my years working with Mr. Young, I realized when you're working in the Congress, sometimes you need to call home to say, hey, what's the political tenor of which candidates are doing better than others? Because the fact is, elections get decided locally. And some people have asked about Eric Cantor's election, and they try to read into it, and they say, is it about immigration? Is it about this? Is it about this? The same lesson in that race is one that we learned from mine. Washington, D.C. doesn't decide elections, local communities do. And I think that's what happened in the Cantor race. Now, that can mean there were issues of immigration, there were issues of whatever it might be, that's probably true. But the fact is, all races are local. Within our party, look, we're about to have a conversation as to the future of the leadership in the House. That's going to happen this week. This Thursday, we're going to have elections to replace Eric Cantor. That debate will get had. I always like to, I'll admit, I'm a Pollyanna. I can be very naive and I get burned. No question, it happens. I don't ever look at the debates we have within our party as a bad thing. I look at them as a good thing. And I think every political party, Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, whatever it might be, they owe it to themselves to have those internal debates. Now the issue is how we handle it. Do we do it with a tone of civil discourse, and do we come out with a representation that reflects where we need to be to represent the interests of the American people moving forward? I think there's a lot of great candidates on the Republican side. I think clearly if you're following things right now, there's going to be quite an inter-party race when it comes to Republican nominee. It's going to look like some of these past elections where it's an open seat after 8 years and you end up with 16 candidates on the stage at the very first debate, and we're all just hoping that we can fast forward to the last couple months to figure out who the candidates are. Listen, I think Hillary's going to be incredibly strong in 16 if she decides to run, and rightfully so. She has a career worth of experience to run.
Congratulations. As a Republican congressman, you have influence in Tallahassee, right? That's not my question.
I have relationships, probably like everybody here does.
You talked
I'm a
about,
constituent.
You talked about veterans dying, very sadly, due to a lack of access to health care. What about the 800,000 uninsured Floridians, many who are dying? And what about the $55 billion of our taxpayer dollars in Florida going to other states? What have you done, and what will you do to influence Tallahassee?
So that's a state issue. You're referring to the Medicaid money, and I would defer to, obviously, and I don't mean this tokenly, I would defer to the legislators in Tallahassee for their decision on that. I do understand that Medicaid has become an increasingly an increasingly large part of the state budget, and the concern is with the long-term costs. Here's my issue when it comes to the state of Florida accepting any money, be it on transportation, Medicaid, or whatever else the issue might be. If the federal government has our taxpayer dollars, it's our dollars that go to Washington. If there's an opportunity to bring those back to Florida, we should look to do that every single time we can. There's no reason not to. There's no reason to suggest that somehow we're saving the taxpayers' money or saving the deficit money by not accepting money out of Washington. That doesn't make sense. That money's going somewhere. It's not going to the deficit. So we should fight for every dollar. The concern with Medicaid and with transportation with all the federal dollars is on the back end. What is the state commitment? And if the state if the state has to commit to X amount of funding in the out years for receiving immediate relief in the next 2 to 3 years, well then that is an honest debate that needs to be had. And that doesn't have to be political. It really doesn't. Because if you ask the question a different way, and I'm just using round numbers, should we burden our state with an obligation of $3 billion a year in years 2019 through 2022? I don't know the answer to that. That's worthy of the debate. But we can't focus on the fact that it's just immediate relief in Washington without also talking about the long-term burden to taxpayers 10 years from now that the state would have to commit to for bringing in that federal money. That's a debate that has to be had, and it's one that I can tell you standing today at Tiger Bay, I'm glad rests within the jurisdiction of my Tallahassee colleagues.
Do you agree with Jeb Bush when he says that the Republican Party is in danger of being perceived as anti-immigrant, anti-female, anti-gay, anti-minorities, and anti-science?
Sure, but that's also a characterization that then we'd have to say the Democratic Party is at risk of being seen as anti-business and anti-entrepreneur and anti-job creator. Neither one of those arguments is actually fair. It's based on a supposition that we assign to political parties. Let's talk about those issues. The issue is not just in messaging, right? Not just in messaging for the sake of spinning, because we shouldn't spin, but it's the ability of each party to talk about their core convictions and why they're right. So if you take immigration, okay? Immigration is one that we need to dispense with the rhetoric on both sides. The right doesn't hate immigrants, and the left is not trying to just give away the taxpayer's house. Let's start with the fact that this is an incredibly hard issue, and there are 13 million people here that are undocumented, and some of them have broken the law. But it's a human story, and the idea sometimes that people say, let's deport everybody, that's nonsensical, right? That doesn't make sense. The challenge is, how do we get this right? How do we get this right? We can move to issues, you mentioned, I believe that the traditional marriage question. Okay, I'm somebody I'm a less government conservative. I'm a preacher's kid. But constitutionally, though I believe as a matter of faith in traditional marriage, constitutionally, I believe if Republicans are going to be a less government party, that also means on issues of everybody's faith. And so if the state chooses to embrace same-sex marriage, then that's a constitutional privilege and something that reflects the tenets of a less government party. We need to address issues straight on, being honest about them. And I think if we can do that, and do it, I'll tell you, with a tone of reasonableness. You know, something, and I understand that my career is not going to be built on the coattails of Mr. Young. But there were several lessons that I learned along the years that now are particularly special to me. A tone of reasonableness and civility is something that I learned from Mr. Young, and I didn't realize it. But we need members of Congress that reflect issues with a tone of reasonableness and civility. That's how we communicate with the electorate on those issues you raised.
In the audience here. We've got to balance the budget here in the state of Florida. Pat Wheeler. Congressman Jolly, apparently the way it works in Congress is all the congressmen kind of look after their own district and let the federal deficit go to hell in the handbasket. So there's some of us here that are very concerned, and we can see that there's a huge problem now, and it's going to get to be where no one's going to want to buy our bonds, and that's going to send interest rates real high, and that's going to send us into a recession, and then Congress won't get the money they'll spend on in their districts. What can Congress do to get together to address this huge issue?
So very quickly, procedurally, what happens is at the beginning of the year, Congress sets an overall budget number, a top-line budget number. From within there, members fight for funding for their district. So that fight under the current rules is not increasing the deficit. The decision about the deficit is at the beginning of the year when the budget numbers are totally set. But I think that's a great question to end on because I want to share something with you, and some of you are going to chastise me this that I'm trying to be political about this, and it's not true. I got into politics at 18, fundamentally on issues related to the economy and taxes and federal spending. I think the greatest threat to our national security is long-term debt spending that one day leads us down the path where we're no longer the world's lone superpower. As a new member of Congress, I'm experiencing firsthand the inefficiency of collective decision-making. 435 members in a room, frankly, it is harder to convince a member of Congress to work in your direction sometimes than it is to convince a voter to vote for you. The way things are going to get done in Washington is to push this in a new area. We have members on one side of the aisle who say no to the Ryan budget. We have members on the other side of the aisle who say yes to the Ryan budget. The fact is we need long-term reforms. But there's nobody in the middle saying how do we actually get there over a longer cost curve so that we can balance the budget once and for all and do it in a way that Republicans and Democrats and independents come together. This is the issue. I will tell you, I take this job very seriously. There was no political, personal, or financial reason for me to get into this office. I shut down 4 businesses. You know what it does to a candidate to run a race to their personal life. I believe we have to address the budget issue. And it frustrates me at times. You know, the no on the Ryan budget was a hard vote, and here's why. Frankly, it was a budget that finally reached balance. And I will say, not politically, the administration's budget never did. The president's own budget only got 2 votes from his own side of the aisle. We have to solve this issue. The thing that I worry about when I'm reflecting on my service, late at night, early in the morning, is actually this issue. How do we accomplish long-term budget reforms that are required for the future of the country in the environment of sometimes very dysfunctional Congress? So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Congressman Jolly. I'd like to award you with this traditional mug, politician for lunch. Thank you very much. The recipient, winner of the famed Tiger, Tom Dunn. Remind you that Tuesday, July 1st is the next program. Bill Edwards will be speaking. It'll be at the St. Pete Yacht Club. We're adjourned. Thank you.
Steve Schmiege is chairman of the Republican Study Committee. So that's the conservative bloc in the House. And yet, he's from Louisiana and found a way to lead the effort on flood insurance reform. So some conservatives in the House would say absolutely no flood insurance reform, and they're just going straight by the numbers. Steve Scalise is a conservative leader who found a way to accomplish flood reform because he understands the importance of it regionally. He also has a sister who lives in St. Pete Beach, so he'd be a good local connection.
Okay, last thing that I got for you then. How do you feel about Beverly Young saying she's going to run against you in 2016?
2016 is a long ways away. Look, there's probably 4 people in this room that will be running against me come 2016. I don't worry about it. Listen, I have a job to do, and frankly, every day I do my job, the people in this community will recognize that perhaps I'm the right person to keep serving. We'll see what happens in 2016.
You're behind Billy for your state.
I have got it.
Okay, very quickly, just one question. You seem very concerned about the VA issue, but at a recent VA committee, you opted to not ask a question when prompted, but Bay Pines is requiring further investigation along with Leonard and others. So how are you monitoring that investigation?
Sure. So we've had several hearings, and I've attended each hearing. In fact, I think the Huffington Post suggested I'd skipped out on a hearing. I missed part of the hearing because I was on the floor fighting for marine science research for St. Petersburg, and so then I ran back to the hearing. If I skipped the question, it was only because, as the most junior member, I'm the last person to ask a question. And after 3 hours of a hearing, oftentimes there's nothing more to talk about at that point. we're monitoring it very closely. We've probably been more engaged at a personal level with the VA Secretary than most members of Congress. I don't believe in political sport. It's about how do we get answers, right? So when I talked about clearing the wait list, that urgency in me developed during a hearing in which we were issuing subpoenas for people to testify about how we got here. And I realized, you know what, that comes second. What should come first is clearing the wait list now. So how do we work with the administration today to clear the wait list? The VA committee is going to have hearings twice a week from now until we get to the bottom of this, and we'll continue to do that. It's the right thing to do. On Bay Pines, we're in direct contact with the administrator. We have a very good working relationship with the administrator there. At our intake day tomorrow, Bay Pines will be represented. They'll have staff at our open house tomorrow.
Great, thank you so
You
much.
bet. Thank you. Nice seeing you.
Nice seeing you.
Nice seeing you.
Thank you. And I give you my card, right?